What's up everyone, Lakonde Mwila here, and we're talking K8s. In the last video, I showed you how to set up an RKE cluster on your local machine. I also expanded a bit on the pros and cons and use cases for local cluster development. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install Rancher onto your RKE cluster. And then we'll go a step further and import an existing EKS cluster into Rancher. In case you're wondering what EKS is, it's AWS's managed Kubernetes service. And Rancher is an open source tool that allows you to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters. As you would imagine, this is something that could be especially useful in the enterprise context, where you're dealing with, well, more likely to deal with several clusters, as opposed to a pet project or a small workload with a single cluster. You can think of Rancher as the infinity gauntlet, and all of your downstream clusters as infinity stones, which makes you Thanos. Rancher is a powerful tool, but if you're like me, you're probably wondering how it works under the hood. It has some core components. These core components are the auth proxy, the cluster controllers, and the etcd data store. The auth proxy is responsible for authenticating users that may be actioning any requests to the downstream clusters that Rancher is managing. In the case that a user is actually authenticated, this request will be forwarded to the downstream cluster's API server, and then a check will be done to see whether or not this user is actually authorized to perform that request. And in the case that they are, then the control plane will take care of the rest in making sure that that actually gets actioned. The etcd component is the data store for the cluster, and the cluster controllers are responsible for essentially regulating the state of the downstream clusters. They make sure that the actual state for downstream clusters matches up to the desired state, and they communicate via a cluster agent. So each one of the downstream clusters has a cluster agent that opens a tunnel and communicates with the Rancher management cluster. So that's enough theory for now. I have posted a link below if you want to dive deeper into Rancher. There's an operator level 1 course that will expand a lot more on some of the things that I've touched on, but we're now going to transition into a demo. All right, similar to last time, I am using Vagrant and VirtualBox to set up virtual machines that will essentially make up my cluster. And so I'm going to start by running RKE up. Great, as you can see, my RKE cluster is all set up, and I'm going to copy over the kube.config file. And once I've done that, I'm going to attempt to connect to it. And I'm going to use K9S just so I can see everything going on over there. And there we have it, the services. Let me take a look at the pods. Perfect. Now, the next steps, now that my cluster is running, is to actually proceed to install Rancher on my machine. For starters, Rancher uses Cert Manager for issuing of certificates, and I'll be going with the self-signed certificate option. And so the first step would be to install Cert Manager on my cluster. Next up, I'm going to create the namespace called cattle system where Rancher is going to be installed. So for that, kubectl create namespace cattle system. Namespace has been created, and the last thing to do is to install Rancher. And as you can see over here, I'm going to be installing it in the cattle system namespace, and I'm making use of a personal DNS name as my host name. And that has been installed, and this will take a bit of time for it to completely roll out, so you might have to wait a few minutes for that. The next thing that you want to do is to make sure that you update the hosts on your machine so that it can actually resolve to the host name that you chose for Rancher, and to make sure that it will be able to redirect that traffic to the virtual machines in the cluster that you set up for your RKE cluster. And in my case, because I'm running virtual machines on my local machine, I just need to make sure that I'm redirecting that traffic to the IP addresses that I set up. As you can see over here, these IP addresses match the ones in my virtual machines. Great, and as you can see, Rancher is installed in my machine, and all that I need to do now is to set up a secure password, and I'll be able to log into the system. Awesome. So the next thing that we're going to be doing is importing the EKS cluster, but you can also have a look at the local cluster over here and explore the dashboard and see the different metrics. But I'm going to go a step back. The next thing that we'll be doing to import an EKS cluster is to add cluster and then register an existing Kubernetes cluster. In my case, it will be Amazon EKS. So I'm going to select that. And I'll have to provide it with a cluster name. And in addition to that, as you can see over here, you will need to have an IAM user that you create in AWS. And what we'll have to do is that IAM user will have to be mapped to an RBAC user as well. And I will be adding it to the system masters inside of my EKS cluster so that Rancher can actually have permission to authenticate and carry out the relevant actions in communicating and managing that cluster. So if I head over to AWS over here and I go to EKS, I'm going to go to the clusters, and as you can see there, I have that is the cluster that I'll be connecting to and managing using Rancher. So the next thing that I need to do is to actually connect to this cluster and update the AWS auth config map and map a new user that needs to be created in IAM. So you need to head over to IAM, and it is pretty straightforward and very intuitive. All right, so I'm going to connect to my EKS cluster. To do that, I update the kube config file, and it's added the new context. I need to make sure that I am actually using the correct user. So I already have a user that I created, and I'm gonna redirect to raw manifests. And you can take a look at the AWS auth. Oops. And you can see I'm mapping this new user that I created called Rancher EKS Control Luke, and I've added it to the group system masters, giving super user permissions. And so just need to run kubectl apply. And that is all done. Okay, so I'm gonna head back here. And as you can see, now it gives me the option to select a cluster, of which that is the one that I wanted to register with Rancher, and it'll go ahead and provision, and this will take a few minutes before it actually connects to it. Once we've done that, we will then deploy a pod. All right, so Rancher is now managing my EKS cluster, and the next thing that I want to do is to deploy a small application to the default namespace. As you can see, there are no workloads deployed at the moment. I'm going to click on the deploy button in the top right. I'm going to call this Node.js Express. And I have an image in Docker Hub called Express Test. And as for port mapping, I'm just going to call this my port. It's 8080. And there's nothing else that I want to set up over here, so I'm going to launch this. Okay, I've launched my pod. The next thing I want to do is I want to edit the YAML, and I want to add a label to the manifest file. Is it here? And once I've done that, the next thing is for service discovery, I want to create a load balancer service that will select my pod using the same label. And this should launch a load balancer in the AWS network, and I should be able to access my application. So I want it to resolve to set of pods that matches a certain selector. I'm going to create the selector key over here and app express test. I'm going to add some advanced options, and the type of service I want is a layer 4 load balancer. And all of this can remain unchanged. No need to update any session affinity. And I'm not really concerned about adding any labels and annotations, but I do want to set up the port mapping. And this, we'll just name that my port. And the service port will be 8080. And if I head over to AWS and I'm in the EC2 section, specifically load balancer section, and you can see load balancer is now being provisioned. And this will take a little bit of time for it to get all set. Once the load balancer is ready, you can see that I'm now able to access my application. And all of that I was able to do through Rancher. Thanks so much for watching. If you're interested in more videos like this, please hit the subscribe button. And if you want to engage with myself or other cloud native practitioners, please do check out the SUSE and Rancher Community website. Till next time.